Chapter 6. At lunch with Tessa and Joy the next day, Karoline handed them both a questionnaire. "It feels weird making you do this now that we're going to be sisters-in-law," Karoline said. "I still can't believe he talked me into marrying him so quickly." She'd had no plans to even start dating a week before, and now she was having a wedding in just 2 days. Joy shook her head. "It's just how they are. Bob and Tessa met at the altar, and Jim and I danced at their reception that Bob didn't even know they were having. Then we got married a few weeks after that. It just kind of happens. Seems to be the Cauldron way." "So, what you're telling me is this horribly abnormal quick wedding is actually normal behavior for a cauldron?" Karoline asked. Both other women nodded. "What am I getting myself into?" "I plan to study the people here, not become one of them." Joy patted Karoline's hand. "It won't hurt too much." "Well, I hope you both know that you're required to help me find a dress to wear. I'd ask Misty, but she's busy getting her band B ready to open." Karoline frowned for a moment. "Did you guys know there are hot springs in town?" Joy and Tessa exchanged a look. "No. Are you serious?" "Where?" Joy asked. "I'm not sure where all they are, but I know that Misty has some in the backyard of the band B. And she's talked to people in town about it a bunch, and everyone denies that it's even possible. Ted thinks they may be trying to preserve the town by keeping tourists away. What do you think?" Tessa's lips quirked. "Yup. That sounds like the people of this town. Our economy is rough, and tourists would help a lot, but let's not let them know we're here." "Ugh." Joy nodded. "Seriously. On my first date with Jim, a man at the next table told me that I need to click my heels together 3 times every time I get kissed by a triplet. Does he think we live in the Wizard of Oz or something?" Karoline shook her head. "Very strange. Somehow it feels like I've fallen into another world here. So many things look and feel the same, but they aren't, and it's perplexing." "You came here to see if people were affected by the geothermal activity. I think you already have your answer." Tessa sighed. "I love it here, but it's a strange place. Even when I interviewed at the school, the principal licked his fingers. Why aren't the people in authority making the others stop? Or is it possible that the culture is like Appalachian culture? Just so insular that no one knows things are done differently outside of their little world?" Karoline shrugged. "That's what I want to figure out, but will I be compromised by being married to one of the objects of their superstitions?" She thought about being compromised by Ted and she grinned. "Yeah, maybe being compromised won't be so bad." The other 2 women laughed. "Ted's a good guy. He's just kind of, well, boring." Joy shrugged. "He'd have been the last of the 3 brothers I'd have chosen to marry." Karoline's eyes widened. "He told me people find him boring. The man proposed to me within seconds of meeting me. That is not boring in my world." "I guess not," Tessa said with a laugh. "I can't imagine Ted being willing to marry anyone without first checking out her financial situation and making sure she fit the level of society he aspired to." "You make him sound like a snob," Karoline said, having a hard time believing anyone could see Ted that way. Tessa shook her head. "Not a snob. No, he's more, well, he's very precise and planned in everything he does, if that makes sense. Like he wouldn't have asked a girl to marry him unless she was in the exact situation that he felt like he was supposed to propose in." "So, you think he's a precog?" Karoline asked. She knew the other women were sensing the strangeness of the triplets as well. It would be best to just lay her cards on the table and see what they thought as well. Joy and Tessa exchanged a look. "Maybe," Joy said, "but if he is, he probably doesn't even realize it. Jim is convinced that he is imagining what the horse thinks when he communicates, but Tessa and I have other theories." You see, all of the cauldrons have some sort of power they don't realize they have. I guess that's the best way of putting it. Tessa nodded. That works. Bob thinks that it's his doctorate that makes him able to know if two animals bred together will produce a champion. We think it's more than that, but we're not telling the men that. All 6 of them have strange abilities to do things no one else can do, and none of them think it's even a slight bit odd. Joy shrugged. So yeah, Ted probably is a precog, but he would never call himself that or even admit that he was different than anyone else. Karoline sat back, looking at the other 2. Okay, I need to know backgrounds if you 2 put that together when the cauldrons can't. I'm a school counselor. Master's in psychology. Tessa is a speech therapist, and we were roommates all through school, and we've worked closely together since. Joy shrugged. We're very interested in people and what makes them tick. Oh, you 2 are going to be great for helping me with this. I want you to do the questionnaires right this second, so no more of my thoughts go into them. Then I'm deputizing you both. Karoline had lucked out with this town, not just with Ted, but with her future sisters-in-law. It was like a giant hand of fate was guiding her every move. Tessa giggled. Do we get badges? I'll make some on my computer. You'll wear them with pride. Karoline picked up her phone as the other 2 began filling out the questionnaires, and she saw she'd missed a text from Ted. Missing you today. Are you sure we have to wait 2 more days to get married? I might die before then. Karoline couldn't help but smile at the message. I'm having lunch with my future sisters. You shouldn't interrupt. We might be plotting against you and your brothers. Isn't that why I should interrupt? You don't want your wife to botch her first coup, do you? If I botch this one, I'll be sent to prison, and there might be no conjugal rights. I couldn't risk that. You're right. Carry on. Karoline giggled to herself. Ted was truly something else, and she was surprised how very entertained he kept her. She checked her email while she was waiting for the girls to finish, and she had one from her doctoral advisor with a quick question about the town where she'd landed. She tapped out a response to him and then she set her phone down, noticing that Joy was finished, and it looked like Tessa was on the last question. As soon as Tessa was done, Karoline took the papers and folded them in half, putting them into her purse. There, now let's talk wedding. It wasn't a subject she wanted to talk about, but as the other 2 had just married, she could at least get some advice from them. We could go shopping, I guess, Tessa said, looking like she dreaded the very idea. Nah, Joy said. We won't torture you that way. Did you guys decide the wedding would be casual? Karoline nodded. Yeah. We did. But what does that even mean? Tessa grinned. Well, Jamie, Cade's wife, wore a sundress for her wedding, and the pictures turned out great. What do you think you'd like to do that would be more like you? Barefoot? And, casual. Like no dress casual, but can I get married without wearing a dress? Is that anything near normal? Joy and Tessa both shrugged. Don't know why not, Tessa said. Talk to Ted and see if he'll go in shorts and bare feet. I don't think he'll care too much. I could really do that? Karoline asked. It had never occurred to her she could go that casual for a wedding. I don't see why not, Joy said. Sounds like fun to me. Karoline picked up her phone and texted Ted. How would you feel about shorts and bare feet for our wedding? Works for me. Let's keep the bare idea going for our wedding night. Karoline felt herself blushing, and she hoped Tessa and Joy wouldn't notice. There was no luck to be had. Joy grinned. Ted got naughty in a text? Oh my. You really do bring out a different side of him. I don't know how. This is the only side of Ted I've ever seen. It was so odd to Karoline that no one else had ever seen Ted this way. He was nothing but fun-loving with her. Tessa frowned. So, what was the first thing Ted said to you? I'm having a hard time reconciling the Ted I know with the guy who proposed to you as soon as you met. Karoline shrugged. He opened my car door, and then he said, "Marry me." At first, I thought he was mentally deficient. You know, the type of guy who proposes to everyone he meets. She had worked in a group home for mentally impaired adults while she was in college, and there was one man who had told her they were married all the time. She knew there were people like that out there. Interesting, Joy said. I think this is where him being a precog comes into play. He knew something about the person in that car being the woman he was supposed to marry. She looked at Tessa, who nodded in agreement. He actually kind of said that, which is why I asked him if he was a precog. It was so weird. Karoline hoped the others would be able to give her insight into what had happened. Tessa laughed softly. I can imagine. I bet he was walking along thinking that he wanted someone's car to break down so he could propose. Which is more than being a precog really, it's making what you want to happen occur, but how? And how does he not know that he does it? But I'm the one who didn't put gas in my car in Black Aces. It's not his fault I ran out of gas. It's mine. Karoline wasn't sure how Tessa's theory really applied. Well, right, but it ran out just when and where he needed it to happen. How long did you sit there without gas? Joy asked. Karoline thought back. Not even 5 minutes. Right. And your phone had died as well, right? Tessa asked, joining in with her friend's theory. Yes. Was your battery low? Joy asked. I thought I had it plugged in, but it must have been low, right? Karoline was starting to get a little weirded out. You don't think he made my phone die? Was that even possible? You just don't seem quite that scatterbrained to me, Joy said, shrugging. Tessa sighed. I don't think it really matters. I think you're the only woman in the world that's just right for Ted. I mean, you find him exciting, he obviously makes you blush, and you care for him. I say you go with the flow, but pay attention to the little things that happen around the cauldrons. I don't know if it's the geothermal activity or if there's something in the water. But something makes the men different. And extra special. And the entire town loony, Joy added. Their waitress approached the table then, sticking her fingers in her mouth and holding them up to the air as she did. The hostess told me to give you 30 minutes, and it's been that. Do you know what you want? She asked. I want you to never lick your fingers when you approach a cauldron again, Karoline said. Do you think you could do it? She watched the other woman carefully, planning to record her reaction. The girl's eyes widened. But that's unlucky. Why? Karoline asked. She knew that she was questioning deep-rooted beliefs, but she wanted to understand just a little better. Because triplets are unlucky. And now that those two are married to triplets, they're unlucky too. The waitress indicated Joy and Tessa. I'm marrying Ted Cauldron on Saturday, Karoline said, watching as the waitress licked her fingers and raised them to the sky. Do you sanitize your hands after you do that? She'd never felt so dedicated to hand washing before. There must have been something in the air to keep her questioning like that. I do. I wash them constantly if there's a cauldron in. As she said cauldron, she did it again. Karoline wondered if her fingers ever pruned up from the constant licking. Tell me some other things that are unlucky. Oh, you know, breaking a window, the number 15, spilling pepper, not stepping on cracks, walking around ladders, stuff like that. Who taught you what was unlucky? The woman shrugged. Is this a test of some sort? Karoline sighed. I'm actually here studying the residents of Cauldron Valley. Would you be willing to fill out a questionnaire for me later? I guess. Tessa grinned. All right, I want a bowl of your baked potato soup. No chives. And lemonade. Joy nodded. That sounds good. Exactly what she's having. Karoline thought about being all girly and stuff, but she decided against it. Soup or salad or even both was not enough to keep her fueled until supper. I want a bacon cheeseburger with double bacon, no lettuce, and no tomato. And no pickles, because pickle P is EU. And water. The girl wrote down their orders. All right. I'll be back in a minute with your drinks. Bacon? Tessa asked. Now I know why Ted wants to marry you. The Cauldrons have a deep and abiding love for bacon. They have good taste, Karoline said, smiling. All right then. If Ted and I are wearing shorts and going barefoot for the wedding, does that mean we tell everyone else to do the same? She loved the idea of no one being dressed up for her wedding. I don't know why not, Joy said. Let's just act like we're going to a picnic or something. Tessa nodded. I'd love that. I bet Griselda would love doing picnic-themed foods for the reception. Is there a need for a reception? With the wedding being that small? Karoline asked. She just wanted a ceremony and to have it all over with. Oh, yeah, Joy said. Don't take Griselda's fun away from her. Besides, then you can be Pop's favorite for a day. Wouldn't his grandsons be his favorites? Karoline asked. It didn't make sense that he would choose a grandson's wife to be a favorite. The other two shook their heads adamantly. Jim had to negotiate with Pops for Joy's hand in marriage. He had to pay her 8 cows. It was 8, wasn't it, Joy? It was 25, thank you very much. Do you think Jim ever paid those cows? Joy asked Tessa, looking perplexed. I think Pops would have found a way to keep you from him if he hadn't. The man was dead set on getting his cows as a bride price. Karoline looked back and forth between the other two, seeing that they were absolutely serious. I wonder how many cows I'm worth. It was a weird question to put to herself, but now she wanted to know. Joy looked at Karoline and studied her seriously. At least 50, wouldn't you think, Tessa? Definitely. Pops would have found a way to get 100, though. We all know Ted has a lot more money than his brothers. Karoline was confused again. He does? Why is that? Things the other two took for granted were completely foreign ideas to her. Joy shrugged. He makes investments that always turn out well. He makes them for the ranch, he makes them for Pops, and he makes them for himself. I'd be afraid to know what the man is worth. I'm a penniless student working on her doctorate. Karoline was suddenly worried she was doing the wrong thing again. Why exactly did Ted want to marry her anyway? Doesn't matter. This family is really special, Joy said. They have faults like anyone else, but they seem able to overlook faults in others in a way I've never seen. I'm proud to be a Cauldron. Karoline frowned. Are you sure? I'm positive. Trust me on this. When their food was set in front of them by the same waitress who again licked her fingers, Karoline wanted to report her to management for being unsanitary. It was gross. What was wrong with the people in this town? Karoline took a huge bite of her burger, and she sighed contentedly. I sure wish they'd serve piles of bacon with a tiny bit of burger on top. I mean, I love red meat, but bacon is truly where it's at. She dipped a fry into a pile of ketchup. I need to join the gym this afternoon. I have said that every day this week, and I've run once, but I need to be good about lifting too. I'm off my schedule. Joy looked at the burger with the pile of bacon on top. So, you exercise, but you don't watch what you eat. I exercise so I don't have to watch what I eat. I eat extra fries? I have to run an extra mile. I have dessert? I have to wear ankle weights when I run. It all works out in the wash. Karoline knew her system was strange to some, but she didn't care. It meant she got to eat all she wanted and not worry about gaining weight. Joy grinned. You're going to be a fun sister to have around. Of course, I am. And you two are going to help me navigate the world of the cauldrons and stay sane. Right? Who said we were sane? Tessa asked, sneaking a fry from Karoline's plate and dipping it in her ketchup. Welcome to the family. Chapter 7. On Friday evening, Misty hosted a small bachelorette party for Karoline. They invited all of the new cauldron wives, and the 6 women snacked and watched an old movie. Karoline thought about bringing up the topic of the strangeness that was the cauldrons yet again, but she decided against it. She didn't know how Jamie and Bobby felt about the men or if they'd even noticed there was anything odd about them. Besides, as much as she loved Misty, the others might not appreciate her talking about their husbands in front of her friend. After the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, they all ate some more, and Karoline made sure everyone got to know Misty. How long have you been here? Tessa asked. Only a month. And I wasn't worried about meeting people because I knew that Karoline was going to be joining me soon. Misty took a deep breath. Besides, other than Karoline, I don't do great with having female friends. Karoline shook her head. You know that's not true. Name one female friend I had that isn't you. Misty narrowed her eyes at Karoline. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Give me a little time. Uh-huh. Misty rolled her eyes at her friend. Did everyone bring swimsuits? You guys have got to try out the hot pots in my backyard. Hot pots? Like hot springs? Really? Jamie was the first to get to her feet. Why hadn't I heard there were any in town? Every time I mention them to someone, they tell me they don't exist, Misty said, shrugging. They sure bring a lot of enjoyment to me, for only being figments of my imagination. Let's all change and meet back here. She pointed out bathrooms, and sent Karoline up to her old room to change in. All of the women squealed as they got into the hot water, and Joy nodded. Yup, someone knows about these. They've been built up, and there are seats in there. They aren't listed on the deed that came with the house, and I have no idea who built them up, but I'm sure going to enjoy them. These things will bring people to my band B. Tessa leaned her head back against the rock. That's going to be a fun fight. Make sure I'm there for it, would you? Misty shrugged. Sure. I don't care who's there, and who can fight me on it. It's my property. Oh, you'll be surprised. Joy shook her head. This town is odd. I know. I refuse to lick my fingers when you ladies cross my path. What about our husbands? Jamie asked. Will you lick your fingers when you see them? I try not to lick any part of my body when I see another woman's husband. You never know how that might be misconstrued. At the end of the night, Karoline said goodnight to the 4 women she considered her new sisters and cousins. She hadn't been sure what she'd think of having a big family, but now that she'd had a taste of it, she was thrilled. Remember, we're all wearing shorts and going barefoot for the wedding. Karoline called out as the other women went to their cars. Jamie laughed. Barefoot sounds good to me. As Karoline and Misty watched the Cauldron women drive off, Karoline said, Amy Banks. Misty looked at her in confusion. What about Amy Banks? She was your friend for a while. Didn't you two double date for prom? Karoline had been trying to come up with another female friend Misty had all evening. Misty nodded. And then I caught her trying to kiss my prom date, and I knew the friendship was fake. I'll think of someone. Karoline was making it her mission. She hated the idea of Misty missing out on the fun of female friends. Misty put her arm around Karoline's waist and rested her cheek on top of her friend's head. To tell you the truth, I never felt like another female friend would measure up to you. So, I'm glad I haven't had one. You're the best friend a girl could ask for. Are you ready to be my bridesmaid tomorrow? Karoline couldn't imagine having anyone else beside her for her special day. As long as I don't have to wear a dress, you know I'm happy. They stood there like that for a while, both of them knowing things would change after the next day. It was their last night together as unmarried women. Finally, Karoline pulled away. I need to go. I have to make sure I do a good job shaving my legs tonight. I always just kind of do the fronts and ignore the backs. Misty nodded. I love you, but I'm not shaving your legs for you. Go home and take care of it. Try to get the paint off your legs, would you? Karoline asked. I wouldn't ask if you weren't in the wedding. Misty looked down. Huh. How long has that been there? At least since I got to town. It's time for it to go, I think. Oh, yeah. Probably. It's kind of a part of me now, though, don't you think? It would be like removing a tattoo I've become incredibly attached to. Karoline sighed. Where were the two of us when they handed out the girly jean? It was one thing that had always drawn them together. I think I was redoing the floor everyone else was walking on, and you were probably in the corner with a book. Karoline nodded. Now I understand what's wrong with both of us. With that, she got into her car, immediately pressing the button to lower the window. Meet me at the church at 3. Promise. I'll be there. But it's not like I can do your hair for you, unless you want a ponytail. I'll do my own hair. I need you holding my hand. All right. I'll try to have the paint off mine then. With a wave, Karoline drove toward her little house that she would be sharing with Ted starting the next night. It felt strange knowing she was about to be married, but she was sure she was doing the right thing. Whether Ted had managed to maneuver it into happening or not. She fell asleep that night, thinking about how it was her last night to sleep alone. She would have Ted beside her every night from then on. Why did that feel so terribly right? Asterisk. Ted paced back and forth at the front of the church. He knew Karoline was in the back, and she was going to marry him, but it seemed to be taking forever for the clock to hit the right time. Jim shook his head at him. Just settle down. I promise it's all going to be okay. Says the man who married someone he'd known for weeks. It's only been days for us. Ted wasn't sure why he was nervous all of a sudden, but he was. He needed today to be perfect. He needed the beginning of his life with Karoline to be, well, perfect was the only word that felt like it fit. Bob shrugged. I only knew Tessa a couple of minutes. And then I didn't really know her. By no, I mean I'd seen her a couple of minutes before. Worked out for us. I seem to remember you getting mad because she thought she should be able to keep working, Ted said, narrowing his eyes at his brother. Well, you know that Karoline is going to keep working, so you won't have that trouble, will you? Bob had a habit of simplifying things in a way that made Ted absolutely crazy. Thankfully, Jim took that moment to say something. Ted, stop worrying about it. You're overthinking things as usual. The two of you agree on the most basic things. Like wearing shorts to your wedding. You're both going to have to make compromises, but when you care for each other, it's easy. Ted took a deep breath and nodded. He'd always thought of Jim as the wise brother, though he was the one who couldn't read. There was just something that was always soothing about talking to him. When Jim wasn't playing jokes on Ted at least. I'm sure you're right. Thanks, Jim. I didn't hear a thanks, Bob. Bob glared at Ted. What Jim said was actually helpful, Ted responded, glaring right back at his brother. While they were triplets, they didn't look much alike at all. Bob had dark hair, Jim had blonde, and Ted was a redhead. The only way they were alike was in their green eyes. It was the one feature they all shared with their cousins as well. 5 minutes, Pastor Dinkelheimler called out as he moved toward the pulpit. As Karoline had requested, the only people in the church were the pastor and his wife, the entire Cauldron clan, Griselda, and Karoline and her friend, Misty. Griselda was already sitting at the piano, and she was playing a haunting melody. It didn't sound like it belonged in a wedding, but nothing Griselda did seemed terribly normal to Ted. That was his favorite thing about her. When the music changed, Ted stood up straight, actually wishing he was wearing a tie so he would have something to straighten. He needed something to do with his hands that had everything to do with how nervous he was. Misty walked down the aisle toward him, and he was sure he saw something blue on her knee. He rubbed his eye, but no, it was still there. That's when Ted realized it was all going to be all right. His bride wasn't someone who was so uptight about anything that she needed things perfect for her wedding. No, she had to know that Misty had paint on her knee, and she wasn't out there throwing a fit about it. When Karoline began walking toward him, his heart swelled in his chest. He'd read the expression a dozen times, but it had always been meaningless. Suddenly he understood, and he wished he didn't. It felt like it was too big. But Karoline, she was walking toward him in a pair of khaki shorts and a soft pink silky-looking tank top. She looked absolutely beautiful to him. Nothing special had been done with her hair that he could tell. It hung in waves over her shoulders, and he wanted to wind his fingers through it. Of course, she had a short little veil in it. He was more than a little amused that she'd gone to the trouble. It didn't match the rest of what she wore at all, but it suited her. When she reached him at the front of the church, he took her hand in his and wound his fingers through hers, bringing her hand to his lips. "You look amazing," he said softly. Karoline couldn't hold back a giggle. When she'd been a girl, and she'd thought about marrying, she had always imagined a beautiful long white gown. Instead she wore shorts and a pink tank top. But this was her in every way. And Ted had accommodated her need to be herself on her wedding day. How could she go wrong marrying a man like that? The ceremony passed in a sea of words that she would never remember later, and when the pastor told Ted to kiss the bride, she grabbed him by the shirt front and pulled him in for a long passionate kiss, involving a great deal more tongue than should be used in a kiss in a church, but she really didn't care. She was a married woman now. Griselda herded everyone into the fellowship hall for the reception, and she realized Joy and Tessa had been right. Griselda had run with the whole picnic theme, and they had fried chicken, potato salad, pasta salad, fruit along with a dip filled with marshmallows, and the most amazing tower of cupcakes Karoline had ever seen. The reception was filled with easy camaraderie, and Karoline wasn't even afraid to eat. Her appetite was already becoming legendary among the family members, so what did it matter if she proved the stories right? After they'd finished their lunch, Griselda called Karoline and Ted over to cut the wedding cake, which in this case meant cutting a cupcake. Was that a brownie? With her hand held by Ted. They each fed each other half of the brownie, and Karoline moaned when she tasted the rich, cream cheese frosting. Without even thinking, she reached for another of the cupcakes and ate half of it in one bite. Out of the corner of her eye, Karoline noticed Griselda bringing a cupcake with red frosting from the kitchen, and she carried it straight to Wyatt, who looked at her like she'd lost her mind for a moment. But then he shrugged and popped the whole brownie cupcake into his mouth at once. Karoline couldn't hold her question inside. "Was that red frosting cream cheese as well?" she called. She felt as if she had to have a cupcake with that frosting now. Wyatt nodded. "Best dang cream cheese frosting I've ever had too." "I wish I could have tasted the red one," Karoline said sadly. "I'm sure it's just the same as the one we had, but with some food coloring," Ted told her, trying to understand what her problem was. "Maybe. But now I want a red one." Karoline sighed. Obviously, she wasn't getting a red cupcake, so she'd have to have another 3 of the other cupcakes. She tried to think about how many calories were in all those cupcakes, and she decided she'd just run every day that week. Even on the days she lifted. That would burn enough calories. Hopefully. Besides, she was sure Ted had newlywed activities in mind that would burn a few calories off. Ted shook his head at her. You need more cupcakes, don't you? Another dozen or so would be nice. He laughed. I really worry about the way you eat. Why? I exercise to make up for it. Every day. You're going to lift with me, aren't you? Sure. If that's what you want me to do, then I'll do it. Ted had never had any desire to lift much, but he would do it for her. Anything for her. Good. It will help me stay motivated if you go with me every day. Karoline hurried over to Griselda and hugged the older woman. Thank you so much for planning this reception for us. The cream cheese frosting is amazing. I need you to give Ted your recipe. Griselda nodded. You don't want the recipe? I don't really cook. But Ted said he would, so we're all set. Karoline didn't care if the older woman thought she was doing something wrong by not cooking. She was making her own choices. A slow smile spread across Griselda's face. You go, girl. Karoline giggled at hearing Griselda try to talk as if she were 40 years younger. I like you, Griselda. Good thing, because this family is stuck with me. When it was time to leave, Karoline tucked her arm through Ted's and waited as several people took snapshots. She knew she was going to look back at her wedding pictures and wonder if maybe she should have worn a real wedding dress, but she could always find someone good at Photoshop to take care of that for her. In the end, what mattered is they were married. As soon as they were alone in the truck, Karoline moved to the middle of the seat and pulled his head toward her for another kiss. I can't believe we didn't get to kiss more. There should be a mandated 53 kisses for every marriage celebration. That would be really nice, wouldn't it? Ted didn't want to let her go for long enough to get to her house. He had a couple of suitcases in the back seat of his extended cab pickup, but they'd have to go to the house in the next few days to get the rest. Karoline moved even closer to him, trying to figure out how to get onto his lap while he was still behind the steering wheel, and she sighed. You know, it would be a whole lot smarter to just drive to the house so we can do this more comfortably. He chuckled. I didn't want to take my lips off you for long enough to drive there. I completely concur with the sentiment, but reality has to sink in sometime. Drive, Theodore, drive. Yes, ma'am. He carefully reversed, only then realizing that his entire family had been watching them in the truck and stood applauding when they finally saw his reverse lights. He was sure Jim was leading the whole thing. Jim was the jokester in the family. He waved happily, deciding it was better to acknowledge them than try to ignore them. He didn't need any of those weirdos following him home and interrupting what was sure to be a better time than they'd had in the church parking lot. Probably he should be embarrassed that his whole family had seen him making out with his new wife that way, but really? They knew what he was planning to do with her anyway. Why would he bother being embarrassed? He parked in her driveway and walked around to open her door, taking her hand and leading her up to the house. When he scooped her up into his arms and carried her over the threshold, she sighed happily. I have always wanted to be scooped. And now you have been? Oh, yeah. Karoline felt thoroughly scooped by him. He put her onto her feet and lowered his head, kissing her softly. Please tell me you're not hungry. She laughed. Well, bacon is an aphrodisiac. He narrowed his eyes at her. Are you kidding? She wanted bacon now? Not really. He sighed. All right. You go get ready for bed, and I'll make us a big plate of bacon. Do you need anything with that? Not at all. Just the bacon will suit me fine. She went into her room, shutting the door behind her and leaning back against it. As eager as she was for her wedding night, she needed a moment to get ready. Bacon seemed like the perfect distraction for him. She changed into a skimpy little sexy thing that one of the Cauldron women had given her. She just wished she could remember which one, though it really didn't matter. She had it written down somewhere. Then she arranged herself on the bed, doing her best to look sexy, but what did sexy really look like? Maybe he wanted her to have a piece of bacon in her mouth for her to look sexy. And really? Who didn't want bacon? The door opened, and he set the plate on the bed in front of her, and then he started removing his clothes. She watched him as if he was performing a dinner show for her as she nibbled the first piece of bacon, but after that, she forgot to be dainty and just shoved pieces in her mouth. When he was wearing just a pair of boxer briefs, she got to her knees and fed him a piece of the bacon, wondering if she was the only one who found the meat sexy. Well, truly it didn't matter. She was going to eat it, and he was going to share it. When she kissed him, his mouth tasted like cream cheese frosting and bacon, and she was sure she'd discovered a new delicacy. The first chance she had, she was going to be slathering all the cream cheese frosting she could find onto bacon. Who wouldn't like that? Ted, she asked, even as she trailed kisses along his neck, which was rather prickly at the moment. Yeah? He wasn't really in the mood for talking, but he was sure whatever she had to say would be pretty important, or she wouldn't be distracting him just then. I think I've discovered a new delicacy, and I have to try it as soon as I have the chance. Karoline had to share her invention with him. She was now obsessed with the idea. Ted wasn't really listening, but he knew better than to ignore her. Oh yeah? I want to try bacon covered in cream cheese frosting. He pulled away and looked into his new wife's beautiful eyes. If you can still think about food, I'm not doing my job very well. Oh, I always think about food. Karoline shrugged. I don't think you could stop me if you tried. Challenge accepted. Chapter 8. Ted stared at the girl in front of him. She wore a sexy blue negligee, and she had bacon breath. How on earth could he not fall in love with a girl with bacon breath? A plate of bacon may as well be the mating call of a cauldron man, and here she was sharing one of his greatest passions. He was sure they'd share a lot more of his great passions before the night was over. He knelt on the bed in front of her, his arms moving around behind her, cupping her bottom and pulling her tightly to him. When she let out a gasp of surprise, he pushed her back onto the bed, coming down on top of her. His lips toyed with hers before straying to her neck and her shoulder. His hand came up to cup her breast, his thumb toying with her nipple through the silky fabric of the thing she was wearing. Can I take this off you? It's in my way. He had no idea how much she'd paid for it, and he didn't want her to think she wasn't getting her money's worth, and when the thought crossed his mind, he wanted to kick himself. Making love to his brand new bride, and he was thinking about money. Always the accountant. Boring as all get out. She nodded, and he removed the offending object of clothing, throwing it to the floor. He wasn't going to be boring, he promised himself. Never boring. His hand stroked over her body, one resting between her legs as he stroked her there. When she gasped, he lowered his head to her nipple, and lightly touched his teeth to the flesh there. She arched against him, and he guessed he was being a little less boring now. At least he hoped so. He carefully moved a finger inside her, stroking it in and out of her, hoping he could help her find her pleasure. He felt like he was a small child with a brand new toy, and he wanted to play all the games with it at once, but when it came down to it, only one thing mattered. Their mutual pleasure. He tried to shut off the accountant part of his brain and just concentrate on making love with the woman he cared so much for. When his body covered hers, she let out a gasp, and he took the sound of pain into his mouth, determined not to let her feel anything but pleasure from that moment forward. Later, she lay with her head on his shoulder, and she sighed happily. Well, that was fun. Next time, let's make sure we have the cream cheese frosting along with the bacon, though, okay? He chuckled. Did I bore you? You spent the whole time thinking about bacon? You are the least boring man I've ever met in my life, Ted Cauldron. I need you to stop always worrying about whether or not you're boring me, because unless I'm yawning in your face, you're probably not. I'm the girl who didn't bother going to any parties in college, because I was too busy studying. I missed my own prom so I could study for my calculus final in high school. Misty still brings it up almost every time we talk. I'm the boring girl. The boring boy is awfully interesting to a girl like me. Really? He asked. He had a hard time believing anyone could find him anything but boring. Really? She stretched. Now I'm hungry though. He chuckled. You and food. I think your love of food is my very favorite thing about you. Oh? Well, that might not be great for the future. I was sure you liked my boobage better than anything else. She looked down at her bare breasts, wondering if she put stickers on the nipples if he'd be more interested in them. Sure, he grinned. Your boobage is honestly very nice, but so is your caboose. Caboose? Now that's a man I can get in front of. I'd say I could get behind you, but you like my caboose, so. He grabbed her and just held her against him. I hope you know that you've changed my life. I used to be the boring brother and cousin, and now I have the knockout wife. I have a feeling your brothers and cousins think their wives are knockouts too. I'm sure they do. They're wrong though. Ted smiled, helping her to sit up. We have no pizza delivery in town, but we could pick something up. We can go to the Chinese place, but it's merely adequate. We've already done the steak place, but it's truly the best restaurant in town. Steak place it is. Those bacon shrimp bites have my name written all over them. Karoline dug through her drawers and found a pair of sweats, which she pulled on over some shorts. Then she put on a sports bra and a t-shirt. We're going to work out after we eat. He groaned. Didn't we just work out? Sort of. We're lifting tonight, though. You said you have a membership, right? He nodded. Yeah. You? Yup, I went after lunch Thursday. It's small, but it has what I need. She shoved her feet into her shoes without untying them and smiled. I'm ready. He was still lying on the bed, with the sheet over his good parts. Are you sure you want to eat now? I'm going to starve to death if you don't feed me, and then I won't be fun in bed anymore. Well, let's feed you then. He sat up and threw on the clothes he'd worn for the wedding. His other clothes were in the car, and these would do fine. It wasn't like he'd be working out in a tux or anything. Let's go eat then. Bacon shrimp bites, here I come. Just be ready for people to do the two-finger salute to you now too. She didn't have to ask what that was. She'd seen it once too often already, and she wrinkled her nose. Someone needs to teach this town about proper hygiene. He laughed. You act like there's a pandemic to worry about. I assure you that everyone in town is perfectly fine when they lick their fingers that way. I don't have to like it. And I'm going to be asking people to meet with me for interviews so they can do my questionnaires. It's time for me to get serious about my doctoral thesis. I think that can wait until Monday, don't you? Why, Mr. Cauldron? Are you suggesting I put off work and have a mad sex weekend with you? Who was calling him boring? It certainly wasn't her. I think that would be lovely. She giggled, wrapping her arms around him. Yes, it can wait until Monday. Everything can wait until Monday except my workout, because I want more cream cheese frosting. It's all I can think about. Well, then it's time for you to have more. I'll call Griselda and tell her we need some at family dinner tomorrow. Are we going to family dinner tomorrow? Karoline knew it was his family's tradition, but she couldn't imagine going the day after they'd gotten married. He shrugged. We should. Pops will want to get to know you better. He's already chastised me for not negotiating with him for your cow price. Karoline giggled. I heard he did that with Jim over Joy. That was crazy. What was really crazy is he had me actually move cows in a ledger from Jim to himself. No one cared whose cows were whose before that. And now? It's all he can talk about. He has 50 more cows than Jim does, and 25 more than the rest of us. Ted shook his head. Cows. So, am I worth 25 cows to you? She asked as she climbed into the passenger seat of his truck. So much more than that. You're worth at least 28 cows. I was hoping for more like 100. You know I'm highly educated, right? That should be worth a couple of extra cows. Ted sighed. I refuse to have this conversation. If Pops demands cows, I'll pay him. Okay? Karoline sighed. I guess. But why would Pops get the cows? Wouldn't it be my father who got the cows? She wasn't about to let the topic go until it made more sense to her. You'll have to ask Pops about that. He's the one who demanded the cows, for no apparent reason. Joy was staying with him for a short while, and I think he liked her, so the whole cow thing happened. Please don't ask him how many cows he thinks you're worth. I don't want to deal with the paperwork. But, you're Ted. You're supposed to like paperwork, aren't you? Ted shrugged. According to my cousins and brothers, paperwork is the be-all and all of my existence. I'm not really a fan though. Even he wasn't that boring. But you do it without complaining, so they think you love it. That's probably true. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've always enjoyed toying with numbers, and my brain is a human calculator, but that doesn't mean I enjoy sitting in an office doing paperwork instead of being out on the ranch with the others. I love being on the ranch. How's Moonbeam? Karoline asked. She'd just remembered what he'd said about the horse. She's the same. Wishing she was no longer expecting. The twins are exhausting her beyond belief. Ted shook his head. I feel strongly that things will be all right, but that doesn't mean I'm not worried about her or the foals. When she finally has the twins, I think we'll all be in the barn trying to help out. Is there anything you can really do? Karoline asked. She hadn't really thought of him in terms of the day-to-day operation of the ranch. I'm as adept with the animals as any of the others are. My strength lies in the accounting portion of things, but I work with the horses the same as the rest of them. Together, we present a united front for Moonbeam and the foals. I think seeing all 6 of us there together is calming to her. That's interesting. I wouldn't think she'd be sensitive to you. It's strange, but in town as well as on the ranch, people think of us as a unit. All 6 of us. Yes, we're 2 sets of triplets, but we're also all cauldrons. I'm not sure if you know this about me yet, but my mother and father were both identical twins, and their identical twins married identical twins. So, my cousins are double cousins. Bob would give you this whole spiel about how we're all biologically brothers. We were raised as brothers once our parents died, and though we think of ourselves as 2 sets of 3, we're also 1 set of 6, with 2 subsets. He shrugged. Yes, I'm getting all mathy. It's what I do when I want to bore the people around me to sleep. Karoline laughed. Wait until I start talking about psychology and my thesis. You'll be on your knees, begging me to shut up. I like hearing about your views on you and your cousins and brothers, though. It's interesting to me. He really did put it all in math terms, but that didn't bother her at all. She'd known she was marrying a man who thrived in mathematical situations. Good. Because I'm not sure I know how to stop talking about all of it. It's my life, and it has been since I was a boy. So, in school, were you better at math than the others? She asked. Oh, yeah. Kate and Bob both excelled at science. Deck was more artsy. Jim excelled at PE and recess. And Wyatt didn't seem to see much use for school at all. He was smart enough, or lucky enough, more likely, to pass his subjects, but he gave Pops and Grams a lot of trouble. He figured with his luck the way it was, there wasn't a lot of need for studying. I can see that. Having met all of his brothers and cousins, they all seemed to fall in line with what he was saying. What about you? She shrugged. I'm your average everyday nerd. I excelled at everything. I worked hard to make sure I did. Math was always my hardest subject, but I always managed to make as with a ridiculous amount of studying, which was my normal. Seriously, when I was an undergrad, all of my suite mates would go out every Thursday night, because most of them didn't have Friday classes. And they'd party until all hours. They'd invite me to go, but I wanted to take the time while the suite was quiet to study. Nerd through and through. Did you get labeled boring too? He asked. She nodded. Always. In high school, most people didn't even notice me. I was the girl with the ponytail who sat at the front of every class. And then the girl whose mother died. And then the valedictorian. She shrugged. I don't need to be noticed. I'm happy to fade into the background. Which is why you didn't need a huge wedding or anything. It suddenly all made sense, and he wondered if he'd fed into her need to be invisible by agreeing to such a casual wedding. Pretty much. If my mom had been alive, I'd have wanted to do the big wedding, because it's what she would have wanted for me. I'm sorry losing her has been so hard for you. She smiled. It sounds like you losing your Grams was just as hard, but in a different way. They walked into the restaurant holding hands, and she felt closer to him than she had before. Being able to talk to him as she had made her feel stronger, but more connected to him at the same time. Barb was their waitress again, and while she was licking her fingers, Karoline broached the subject of interviewing her. You're from here in Cauldron Valley? Most people don't move here, Barb said with a smile. If you weren't born here, there's really no reason to move to the back of Beyond. I moved here for research, Karoline said with a smile, but I'll stay for a man. Barb's eyes widened. Don't tell me there's another Cauldron wedding on the horizon. You boys are all falling fast and hard. Ted couldn't help but grin. I guess I should officially introduce you to my wife, Karoline Cauldron. Then he paused and looked at her. You are taking my last name, aren't you? He couldn't believe they hadn't already discussed it. I think if I'd already finished my doctorate, I wouldn't, but since I haven't, I will. Logical, huh? I guess. What difference does it make? He asked. Well, I want the name I used to be the same one I used for my doctoral thesis. Because I haven't put my maiden name on said thesis, I'm happy to put Cauldron on it and on me. Karoline grinned at him, realizing her reasoning probably sounded convoluted, but she just didn't care. It was her reasoning, not his. Ted moved his head in a circle as if he was trying to follow her meaning. All right. I guess bottom line is you'll go by Cauldron. Yup. Barb stood with a grin on her face listening to the whole thing. Well then, since you're both Cauldrons, can I start you off with something to drink? After they'd both placed their drink orders, Ted said, and we need the bacon shrimp bites. I'm not sure my wife will ever let me eat here without having those again. She shouldn't. Not if she's smart, anyway, and your wife looks awful smart. Barb smiled. Speaking of smart, can I interview you for my doctoral thesis? Karoline thought Barb was probably a good indicator of what people in town were like. I don't even know what that is, but sure. Interview me. Should be fun. Great. Thank you. If you'll give me your phone number before we leave, I'll call you Monday and set up a time for us to meet. Barb nodded as she hurried away. How well do you know her? Karoline asked. Everyone in town seemed to know everyone else, which was very different from where she grew up. Of course, she'd grown up in a decent-sized city, not a small town. We were in the same grade in school, so I knew her pretty well. She married a buddy of mine. Ted shrugged. He hadn't thought much about Barb even when they were in school. She'd dated the same guy all through high school and married him right after graduation. It was pretty typical in their town to do so. I see. Right out of high school, she guessed accurately. He nodded. Yup. Most people in town did. Unless they went off to college, and not nearly enough of the kids here went to post-secondary school, in my opinion. I see. Not everyone is cut out for college, of course, but a lot of people just think that they need to stay where their family has always lived. Karoline shrugged. Your family has been here 170 years or so. That's a really long time to live in one area, though people did that for centuries. He nodded. My family has the land we got from Uncle Sam back when it was Oregon Territory. We've purchased land from others over the years, and we have a huge spread. Why would we leave? Very true, but what about the people who live in town? They don't have that kind of land, and yet they stay here generation after generation. Do you ever wonder why? He shrugged. Not really. I guess it just seemed like it's what people do. Do others move around more than we do here? Yes, she said. Most people don't grow up and die in the same state where they were born. Some states have as little as 25% of adults being natives. I had no idea. Any idea what the rate is in Montana? Higher than most, believe it or not. Over 40%. I always wonder why. She shrugged. I'm sure all that will come out in my thesis as well. I'm getting more excited to start writing it every day. How long will it take you to gather the information you need and write it? He asked. Probably anywhere from 2 to 4 years. There's so much involved. Karoline shrugged. I don't mind though. I really like this town, and I'm making it my home. I'll be done when I'm done. The bacon-wrapped shrimp landed in front of them, and Karoline reached for her first piece. And I would stay anywhere that served shrimp like this. Ted couldn't help but smile at that, but he wondered how much of the reason she was staying was for him, and how much was for her research. He would like to think it was all him, but she was too driven to let him believe that for long. Chapter 9. Late the following afternoon, Ted and Karoline headed out to the ranch for Sunday dinner. I hope there's dessert with cream cheese frosting. And bacon, Karoline said, licking her lips. She couldn't get the idea of the combination out of her head, no matter how hard she tried. Well, I put in a request for cream cheese frosting, but I didn't mention bacon. Ted shook his head at her. You have strange cravings, and you're not even pregnant. He couldn't imagine what she would be like if she ever did have a child. The idea was almost scary. I don't think it's strange. It sounds good. Like chocolate chip cookies dipped in French onion dip. Or cheese and hot chocolate. They sound a little weird, but once you try them, you know they are truly a gift from heaven. Karoline had always been adventurous about trying new things once or twice, but if they were nasty after twice, she was done with them. I'll keep that in mind. When they got to the ranch, Karoline jumped out of the truck and hurried up to the door. She knocked, and little CJ came to the door. We don't knock at Pop's house. He gets all grumpy when we do, and thinks he has to stand up, so we just walk in. The little girl calmly explained how things were supposed to be done, and Karoline nodded as she listened. Thanks for letting me know, CJ. Karoline had met the little girl a couple of times now, and she seemed so bright. If Karoline could be guaranteed to have a daughter just like CJ, she'd be all for having kids. Dozens of them. You're welcome. CJ took Karoline's hand and pulled her into the house. Look, it's Aunt Karoline. Bobby frowned at her daughter. She's not really your aunt, because Deck is her husband's cousin. Well, I'm not going to call her cousin Karoline, because that would just be weird, so she's Aunt Karoline. Karoline nodded emphatically. I like her logic. She'd never imagined being an aunt to anyone, and here she was holding hands with a little girl who was insisting on calling her Aunt Karoline. She felt warm inside as she smiled at the girl. Me too, Joy said, walking over to stand beside Karoline. I heard you need the cream cheese frosting. I sneaked you a bowl and put it in a drawer in the fridge in the garage. I'll get it for you before you go. The last part was just a whisper. You're the best sister-in-law I've ever had. Karoline threw her arms around Joy, hugging her tightly. What am I? Chopped liver? Tessa asked, walking into the room just in time to hear Karoline's proclamation. Well, if you could smuggle me just a little bit of bacon, Karoline said softly. She was not above bribery. Especially if said bribery included bacon. Joy made a face. You're having bacon with the cream cheese frosting? I'm not sure I can be a party to that. I'll let you know if it's any good. Karoline smiled. I can just taste it in my mind, and I know it will be the best thing I've ever put into my mouth. I'm seriously doing everything I can not to drool as I think about it. Joy and Tessa exchanged a look. Let's not let her cook for us, Joy said. Tessa nodded emphatically. Definitely not. All right. You'll miss out then. Karoline laughed. I can only cook bacon. Seriously. And then only in a microwave. I'm a cold cereal with bacon for every meal kind of girl. Unless she ate out of course, which she did more than her share. It didn't help a college girl's budget, but she made things work. Tessa laughed. It's a good thing the Cauldron men can all cook then, isn't it? It is. Ted said he enjoys cooking, and all I can think is more power to him. I'm not about to do it, and someone will need to. Of course, we could go to the steak place every single night for their bacon-wrapped shrimp. Karoline licked her lips. She wanted it again already. Joy grinned. And how many extra miles do you have to run for the bacon-wrapped shrimp? Karoline sighed. I don't even want to think about it. Probably an extra 2, but man, it's worth it, right? It's a good thing I love running, because I'm never going to stop eating the bad stuff. If you say so, Tessa said. I'm more the type who would rather watch what I eat than torture myself with running. Oh, I like to run, so I guess that's why I don't mind so much. It was weird the high Karoline got from working out. She'd never even thought about doing things a different way. Jamie and Bobby wandered over. What are you three talking about? Jamie asked. You've been hogging the new girl in town. Tessa smiled. Well, you've been hogging Bobby. I guess we're even then, aren't we? Jamie grinned at Tessa. Karoline loved that all of them seemed to get along so well. She was sure once she was really part of the group, she'd know more about what was happening behind the scenes, but for now, it just felt good to be there and accepted. Karoline felt as if she fit right in with this group of women instantly, which was something that was a big relief to her. Despite her big talk with Misty the other night, she had only really had a handful of female friends in her life. It seemed that most women she knew were so busy trying to one-up one another they weren't any fun to be around. These women seemed different, and she was so glad. She would have hated to have to feel like she was in competition among family. Oh, Karoline said. I brought Bobby and Jamie questionnaires. Fill them out before we talk much, because I want your impressions and I don't want them skewed by my theories. She handed the papers to both of the women. Jamie looked down at the questions, and she smiled. These are going to be fun to fill out. I'll get it to you before we all leave tonight. Bobby glanced at hers. Yup. This town is weird, and your questions are going to help the whole world know that. That's what I was thinking, Karoline said. With our group of various specialties, I'm probably going to try to persuade all of you to help me with my thesis. At least be a focus group to help me form my theories and conclusions. Bobby's eyes landed on her daughter. Well, as long as I still have time for CJ, I don't mind at all. The others all nodded. All right. Do the questionnaires, and then I'll pick your brains as a group and individually in a week or two. Ted thinks we need time to do the newlywed thing before I throw myself head first into my project. Karoline knew she could do both well, but if it made him happy, then she'd comply with his wishes. As they all sat around the supper table, it was obvious Pops was holding court. He kept smiling at little CJ, and it was obvious he wanted more grandchildren. Dozens more. Karoline observed the other couples, and though they'd all married ridiculously fast like she and Ted had, she could see that there was real love between the partners. For a moment, it made her feel comforted and loved as well, but then she realized that she and Ted didn't have that. Oh, he felt passion for her, but he didn't love her like she loved him. She stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth as she thought that, and she dropped it with a clang. You can't be done yet, Ted joked. You haven't even eaten your thirds. Karoline wasn't even sure how to respond. She'd just realized she was in love with a man who she'd only known for a week, who was her husband. How had she married a man she'd just met a week before? Had she lost her mind? The entire week washed over her in a wave, and she wondered how she'd gone from a very single woman intent on nothing but her doctoral thesis to someone's loving wife in such a short amount of time. Karoline? Are you all right? The voice was Ted's, but it sounded like it was coming from so far away. Karoline shook her head, and she realized everyone around the big dinner table was staring at her, as if they were expecting her to grow feathers and try to fly away. Yeah, sorry. Lost in thought. She picked up her fork and continued eating, but she knew she was doing it without her usual gusto. She was in love with her husband, and he felt nothing for her other than that he was supposed to marry her. She didn't even believe in destiny. They were two very opposite people who were married, and she was in love with him? How on earth had it come to this? There were concerned looks coming her way, but she finished her meal, trying to ignore them all. What did anything matter anymore? She was in love with her husband, and life would never again be the same. Chapter 10. Before Karoline and Ted left his grandfather's house, Joy handed her the cream cheese frosting. I need to know how your experiment goes. I can't believe it could possibly taste good, but you have me curious now. Karoline nodded absently. I'll text you with the results. She couldn't even focus on her bacon and cream cheese frosting. She could only think about the fact that she was in love with Ted, and he felt nothing for her. Karoline? Are you sure you're okay? I'm a safe person to talk to. Joy looked at her worriedly. Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a little revelation during dinner that I wasn't expecting. I'll get over it. Karoline folded the questionnaires that the other women had given her and stuck them into her purse. Thanks for caring. It felt good to have new friends who cared about her like Joy and Tessa obviously did. Always. That's what sisters are for. Joy walked back to where the others were all sitting around together, listening to a story Pops was telling. Karoline stuck the tub of frosting into her oversized purse before going over and kissing Pops on the cheek. I heard you thought Joy was worth 25 cows, she said, spreading her arms wide and spinning in a circle. What about me? Pop's whole face lit up at the question. He was obviously in his element. Well, you're as pretty as a summer day, just like my Joy. Let me think. Pops put one finger to his cheek and thought about it seriously. I'm going to ask for 100 cows for you. You and Joy are worth the same amount in my mind, but I happen to know Ted has more money than any of his cousins or brothers, so he should have to pay more for his bride. Jim nodded emphatically. I'm not sure paying 100 cows for Karoline's bride price is enough, Pops. Make it 250, and I think we'll all be happier. Oh, yeah. Jim is right, Pops. Ted should have to pay at least 250 cows. Bob nodded his agreement of his brother's statement. Wyatt grinned. I'll bet he says no to the 250 cows. Bob grinned at his cousin. You're on. Karoline bit her lip to keep from laughing. This distraction was just what she needed to stop worrying about whether or not Ted had feelings for her. When her eyes met Ted's, he shook his head. Sorry, she's not worth 250 cows. Karoline felt her heart fall. Could he really not even pretend she was worth that much to him in front of his family? She was mortified. She's worth 1,000 cows, but we don't run that many on the ranch. I'll pay you that much in cash. Will that work for you, Pops? Karoline's face grew serious. 1,000 cows? You really think I'm worth that much? She had no idea how much 1,000 cows were worth, but it sounded like a lot, and it made her feel good about herself. Ted nodded. And so much more. I will always be thankful for the day I found my beautiful Temptress on the side of the road out of gas. She flew into his arms, hugging him tightly. I love you, Ted. I know we've only known each other for a week, but I can't help how I feel. Hopefully he wouldn't mind that she was bearing her feelings. I don't want you to help how you feel. Ted kissed her, pulling her closer to him. I love you right back. I wouldn't have married you otherwise. Her eyes narrowed. I'd believe that, but you proposed before I ever had a chance to even say anything to you. How can I believe you loved me then? She couldn't throw logic out the window with his declaration of love, no matter how much she wanted to. Ted shook his head at her. I knew who you were before you were there. I think I wished you there. You, Karoline Cauldron, are the woman I've wished and dreamed of every day since I figured out that girls were for more than chasing around at recess. I love you more than I ever dreamed I could love anyone. He'd had no idea she didn't realize he loved her. He should have told her, and he vowed to himself he would do that every day for the rest of their lives. Karoline melted into him, suddenly wishing they were back at their little house so they could do more than kiss. I love you right back. When the applause started again, Ted didn't even have to think about who started it. He knew it was Jim, and he just didn't care. He'd found the woman he'd dreamed of his whole life, and he loved her with everything inside of him. How could he possibly care that his entire family was making fun of him? Let's go home, and I'll show you just how much I love you, Ted said, slipping his arm around her and walking toward the front door. Good night, Ted, Pops called, folding his hands on his belly and propping his feet up. 5 down. Only 1 to go. When everyone looked at Wyatt, the last unmarried man of the Cauldron 6 held his hands up in front of his face, looking a little sad. Don't even think it. I'm never getting married. Karoline simply waved as they headed out the door. When they got home, they'd have bacon dipped in cream cheese frosting, and they'd make love. What else could a woman ask for in life? Epilogue. Wyatt swallowed down his jealousy as he watched his cousin lead his new wife out the door. Ted was the most boring of all of them, and even he had found a woman to marry him at the blink of an eye. Or a flip of a coin. Sighing, Wyatt jammed his hands into his pockets and turned back to the celebration, which continued even though Ted and Karoline had left. He watched Deck lift little CJ into the air and spin her around, and smiled a little sadly at the sound of the girl's giggle. Pops had been right. He was the last cauldron standing. But he'd taken a wager. Each of his brothers and cousins had put $1,000 against him, in his claim he wouldn't marry. And Wyatt had taken it. His incredible luck, or was it something more? Meant that he'd win. He wouldn't be marrying anytime soon. Because there was only one woman in creation he wanted, and he couldn't have her. And if he couldn't have Artemis Weston, his best friend's little sister, then he wasn't going to marry at all. And you can bet on that.